Okay, so there's the memory function of the unconscious, and there's the dissolutive function. That's an interesting one. The unconscious contains habits, once voluntary, now automatized, and dissociated elements of the personality, which may lead a parasitic existence. That's an interesting one. I would relate that more to procedural memory. You know, so what you've done is practice certain habits, whatever they might be. Let's call them bad habits. And you like those things to get under control, but you can't. So maybe when you're speaking, for example, you use like and you know, and you say a lot. And you've practiced that, so you're really good at it. And you'd like to stop it, but you don't get to, because you've built that little machine right into your being, right? It's neurologically wired, and it's not under conscious control. And anything you practice becomes that. It becomes part of you, and that's another element of the unconscious, a different part. And then there's a creative part, which is that, well, you know, you're sitting around and maybe you're trying to write something, or maybe you want to produce a piece of art or a piece of music, or maybe you're just laying in bed dreaming and you have all these weird ideas, and especially in dreams, it's like, where do those things come from? And even more strange, one of the things that's really weird about dreams, and almost impossibly weird, is that you're an observer in the dream. It's like a dream is something that happens to you. Well, you're dreaming it, theoretically, so how is it that you can be an observer? It's almost like you're watching a video game or a movie, but you're producing it, at least in principle, although the psychoanalysts would say, well, no, not exactly. Your ego isn't producing it, your unconscious is producing it. It's a different thing. It's a different thing. And of course, Jung would say, well, it's deeper than that. The collective unconscious might be producing it. It's in some sense, it isn't you exactly, or it isn't the you that you think of when you think of you. And that's the ego from the Freudian perspective, the you that you identify with. That's the ego. And outside of that is the unconscious. The id, that's more the place of impulses. And you could think about those as the biological subsystems that can derail your thinking, right? And that govern things like hunger and sex and aggression and your basic instincts is another way of putting it. And it's a reasonable way of thinking about it, because these are subsystems that you share with animals. You share them certainly with mammals. You share most of them with reptiles. You share a lot of them with amphibians, and even going all the way down to crustaceans. There's commonality, for example, in the dominance hierarchy circuits. And so these are very, very old things. And the idea that you're in control of them is, well, you're not exactly in control of them. And I would say the less integrated you are, the less you're in control of them, and the more they're in control of you. And that can get really out of hand, you know. You can be, like with people who have obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, which seems to be, I would say, the dissolutive elements in some sense of the unconscious, the way that it's portrayed here. Poor people with obsessive compulsive disorder, they can spend half their time doing things that they can't really control, and they have very strong impulses to do them, and it's very hard on them to block them. You know, they'll almost panic if those things are blocked. And then you have people with Tourette's syndrome, you know, that they'll be doing all sorts of weird dances and spouting off obscenities and imitating people without being able to control it, and sometimes a little bit of antipsychotic medication can dampen that down, but it's as if there are these autonomous semi-spirits inside of them that grip control over their behavior and make them do things. And you know, you find that to some degree in your own life, because maybe you've become very attracted to someone, even maybe you don't want to be attracted to the person, and then you find yourself, you know, texting them when you know perfectly well that you should be going to bed, and you know, you're in a grip of something, and you can't control it, and that's all part of the unconscious and all part of what Freud was studying. The dynamic unconscious, it's alive, and it's a composite. The mind is a composite of contradictory drives. Now, the way Freud thought about this basically was that with the id and the ego and the superego. So if you think about the id as the place where these contradictory drives emerge, so it's sort of nature within. The ego is the thing that's sort of being pushed back and forth by those contradictory drives, and the superego is the thing that's on top saying, you better behave yourself, you better behave yourself. And so it's a different model than the Piagetian model, because Piaget assumed that what would happen is that as the child, and I like the Piagetian model better, I think in healthy development, the Piagetian model is correct. But in unhealthy development, I think the Freudian model is correct. That instead of integrating, say, the aggressive and sexual drives, for the sake of argument, into your personality as you develop, what happens is the superego just represses them. Instead, so they don't become a dynamic part of you, integrated into your ego. They're just repressed. You just don't manifest them. And so that's how you be a good person, and you can be the victim of a very harsh superego. And that often happens if you've had a particularly tyrannical parent, one or both, or maybe a tyrannical grandparent, or maybe you're your own inner tyrant and you've picked up tyrannical voices through your whole life and aggregated them into this terrible judge that's always watching you, that's criticizing everything you do and restricting you badly and really badly in what you're allowed and not allowed to do. You see that with anorexic women. Well, men could be anorexic too, but it's much less rare. They have superegos that are just, or it's one way of thinking about it, they're just deadly. They're just criticizing every bit of them. Well, right to the point, they're really criticizing them out of existence, right? Is you have to be so perfect that the perfection is not aligned with the ability to live. You don't get to eat. You know, and people like that, they look at their bodies, they even look at their bodies incorrectly. Like anorexics seem to be unable to see their bodies as a whole. They can only see their bodies as parts. And when you start seeing your body as parts, you're really in trouble because you can't get a sense of actually what it looks like. And body perception is very, very complicated. But anyways, Piaget thought about the ego as, in some sense, as the game that's played by all these dynamic drives that's shaped by the broader community, and so that could all be integrated. But Freud would say, well, look, when that doesn't happen, instead you're subject to the tyranny of the superego, and it just says you should never be angry, right? You should never express yourself sexually, because if you do, there's something wrong with you. You're a bad person, and you're a bad person if you ever get aggressive. And then people who are living like that under those circumstances, you know, they're repressed is the right way to think about it. Now, Freud was interested in the idea that mental disorders could be caused for two reasons. One would be purely bodily, like maybe a head injury, or say in the case of schizophrenia, which is a good example, or manic depressive disorder, we have reason to believe that there's something physiological going on, even though identifying that has been very difficult. And it's probably because there isn't one form of schizophrenia. There's probably many pathways of brain injury that lead to schizophrenic-like symptoms, and there's likely not one form of manic depressive disorder either, if you think of the form as having a standard causal pathway. We know that there are, because we've done genetic studies on people who have manic depressive disorder in their family, and you can identify genes within a family that seem to be contributing to the disorder, but the problem is that those genes don't seem to be. So then you'll take another family group with manic depressive disorder, and it'll be a different genetic combination that causes that. So part of the reason why it's difficult to associate even the more biological mental disorders with biology all the way down is because they're so complex. And then there are other forms of mental disorder that don't seem to be structural at all. They seem to have more to do with, well, let's call it the psyche, right? And that it's more like the contents of your thought have a problem rather than the structures underlying your thought. And of course, that distinction is difficult to make in a fine-grained way, but you kind of get the point. I mean, just because there's an error in your thinking doesn't really mean that the underlying biology in some sense has been compromised. It's complicated because if the error is bad enough, then it can compromise the underlying biology. But whatever, it's a conceptual distinction, and part of the conceptual distinction is helpful if you're trying to think, at least in part, about how you might cure it, because if you're thinking about a brain disease, then that implies a different course of treatment, at least in principle, than it does if you're thinking about a psychological disorder, where you might think about talking to someone, for example, and straightening out their thoughts or helping them learn to behave in a different way. And it was really Freud who started to think that he was the first person to really posit, and this is pretty interesting, to directly posit that dialogue or conversation or speaking could be curative. And that's another thing that people don't like to give him credit for. I mean, there wouldn't be all these helping industries, social work and psychology and biological psychiatry, insofar as that also involves communication and counseling and all of these things. None of that would have existed in all likelihood if Freud wouldn't have made the original hypothesis that there was something about communication that could be curative. Now, Freud believed that experiences that hadn't been, now, he thought about experiences as repressed, and this goes back to the videotape idea of memory. So the idea would be that you have a record of everything that's happened to you, and the record's actually accurate. And then some of those things that happened to you were very, very shocking to you, or very hurtful, or very depressing, or very threatening, and so you've decided that those have become repressed. You're not paying any attention to them. Now, he has a complex mechanism to account for that, and I actually think this is a place where his theory went badly wrong, because you don't have a videotape memory, and it isn't obvious that the memories that you have of traumatic events are fully fledged and causally appropriate, but just not paid attention to. It's more like they're murky and unclear in and of themselves, and they contain too much. And I don't think that people so much repress as they do refuse to attend to, or are unable to attend to. So it's more like a passive avoidance than a passive avoidance of something that needs to be explored and gone through, rather than it is something you know that you don't want to look at, that you or part of you has put away. And I think that's a major weakness in his theory, and has led to a lot of problems with the idea of repression per se. But anyways, that was his idea, that terrible things have happened to you, and you, or some part of you, doesn't want to know about them, And so they live those repressed experiences live an autonomous life of their own too. And here's an example of a trivial example of how that might work. Imagine that you're at work, and your boss says something to you that disturbs you. Maybe it makes you question whether your job is stable. And so you're kind of upset about that, but it's a casual, offhand comment, and you go back to work and you just sort of forget that even happened. Maybe because you're attending to something else. But then you go home and you're just crabby as can possibly be, and you go home and one of the people there says something a little annoying and you snap at them. It's like, well, that's analogous to what Freud would call a complex, right? Is that because you can imagine what's happened is that the boss's words have brought up a whole little sub-personality predicated on doubt up to the surface. And who knows how deep that would be? Well, what happens if I lose my job? And if I lose my job, well, what sort of person am I exactly? And what about all these other times that I've failed? And then maybe you remember the other times that you failed. And what am I going to do in the future? And so it's this whole cluster of ideas that surrounds that doubt. And that's been activated. It's just a little part of you. And then maybe you're not attending to that because you're busy doing some other work. But when you go home, something triggers it. And it's already there. You get way more upset than you should. And that's what a complex is, except in a much more complicated manner. Like a complex might be a whole series of experiences that you've had that are united by some emotion, like threat, that haven't been transformed into a coherent representation, but that can rise out of the unconscious and possess you. If you guys, many of you guys have been depressed at least one point in your life, it's actually very common for University of Toronto students, especially in their first year. It's about 1 in 3. If you give students the Beck Depression Inventory, about 1 in 3 University of Toronto students in our research have hit criteria for hospitalization. I mean, the Beck is a little oversensitive as far as I'm concerned, but